So tonight's frequently asked question is the resurrection of Jesus a hoax? Is the resurrection of Jesus a hoax? Muhammad died at the age of 62, apparently in the arms of the youngest and favorite of his 9 wives. Today you can go to his tomb in Mecca, where his body is buried, and millions make an annual Hajj there. The Buddha died in peaceful serenity among the villagers of Kushanara in Uttar Pradesh, aged 80. His body was cremated and his ashes divided into 8 parts. Today you can visit the mound-shaped monuments called stupas. Moses died on Mount Nebo at 120, having glimpsed the promised land with the future of the nation he had liberated assured. Today, if we knew where Moses was buried, you could go to his tomb and pay your respects. Jesus died aged 33 in Jerusalem, publicly executed and then placed in a burial chamber. Yet today, if you were to go to the tomb, you will not find the carefully preserved remains of a body, but an empty hole in the ground. His followers visit the garden tomb in Jerusalem, not because he is there, but because he is not. It is to the extraordinary truth of the resurrection of Christ that the evidence of the empty tomb in Jerusalem points us. And yet that truth, the truth of the resurrection, has been and is contested in several key areas. Firstly, that Jesus never really died on the cross. It's a pretty discarded theory nowadays, but a few people still try to argue that Jesus didn't actually die on the cross. He swooned, and though badly beaten by the flogging, severely wounded by the nails of crucifixion driven into his hands and feet, he revived in the cool of the tomb and managed then to convince his followers that he really was the Lord of life. The trouble with this theory is that the Romans were very good at killing people, and crucifixion was a particularly effective form of capital punishment. In John's account of the crucifixion, it's just a few paragraphs before the reading Nikki brought to us from chapter 20. There, in chapter 19 of the Gospel of John, the Roman soldiers didn't want to offend Jewish sensibilities by leaving a dead body on the cross during the Holy Sabbath, so they came with the intention of speeding up the process of death by breaking Jesus' legs. However, when they get to the cross where Jesus has been hanging, they discover that he has in fact already died. And so to make doubly sure, they spear his side, piercing the pericardial sac of the heart as blood and water spurt out. John records that particular detail in his gospel. So Jesus was definitely dead. Another area that's contested is the area that someone stole the body of Jesus. Now, this objection has always come to grief on the issue of the motive. Why? Why would anyone want to steal the body of Jesus? If it had been the authorities in Jerusalem, all they had to do was produce the body. And the day the disciples started talking about the resurrection of Jesus, having seen him alive, then the whole thing would have collapsed. If it had been the disciples who had stolen the body, then why? And why would some of them eventually be prepared to die for what they knew to be a lie? And then the body snatchers, the grave robbers. Why would the grave robbers have bothered to leave the grave clothes neat and tidy, which is one of the interesting bits of evidence in the New Testament accounts of the resurrection of Jesus? They can't find the body, but they find the grave clothes neat and tidy. In any event, how would any of these groups have managed to overpower the Roman guard that was set over the tomb to watch it? The third theory that is put forward is the idea that the disciples hallucinated. And because they wanted Jesus to come back so badly, they believed they'd seen him. It's a basic assumption, is that the disciples expected Jesus to rise from the dead. But if you read the New Testament accounts of the resurrection, the reverse is the case. The resurrection caught the disciples by surprise. Each time Jesus appeared to them, he was both unexpected and unaccepted. The truth is that it wasn't the disciples who convinced themselves that Jesus was alive. It was Jesus who had to convince them. On 3 separate occasions, this hallucination, so-called, was not recognized as Jesus. We had one incident in the garden with Mary in the reading. Might you not at least hope, as C.S. Lewis says, that God would get the face of the hallucination right? Is he who made all faces such a bungler that he cannot even work up a recognizable likeness of the man who was himself? And so you see, as you work through these theories, you're left with the astonishing fact that the only explanation that accounts for all the documented evidence is that the resurrection is true. Another theory put forward to contest the resurrection narrative is that the disciples went to the wrong tomb. Now, this theory tends to be exploded by the way in which the accounts make it very clear that the tomb in which Jesus was laid and buried belonged to a well-known public figure. Again, in the earlier part, just a paragraph up from where we read in John's Gospel, chapter 19, that well-known public figure was Joseph of Arimathea. And he had his own very well-known private burial ground. And it was into that particular burial ground that the body of Jesus was laid. And in one of the parallel accounts to John in Matthew's Gospel, Matthew records how the women who'd been there at the cross during Jesus' final hours remained close by and watched as Joseph with others took Jesus' body and placed it within his own family tomb and sealed the tomb with a large rock to prevent people from stealing the expensive spices with which the body would have been embalmed. Mark, another gospel writer, tells us that the women had hoped to anoint Jesus' body themselves, but the arrival of the Jewish Sabbath interrupted them, and so they returned early on the Sunday morning to finish what they had started. The women, in other words, knew the exact location of the tomb. And that's why, as John develops his account of the resurrection at the beginning of our chapter, he describes Mary Magdalene, going to the tomb and discovering to her surprise that the stone was not there. And her reaction and that of the other disciples gives us that interesting angle on the case for the resurrection of Jesus. They weren't expecting it. They weren't looking for it. So, the way in which the gospel writers put the account together makes it very clear that this was a real death. Jesus really died, and he was really buried. Equally, the gospel accounts, and John is one of those, make it very clear that the resurrection of Jesus was real too. This was a real burial, a real death. It was also a real resurrection. Now, we need to be careful here when we talk about the resurrection in this way. John and the other gospel writers are not saying that someone actually witnessed the moment of resurrection. That is not the evidence physically which is being offered to support the view that Jesus was raised bodily back to life. No, the resurrection is God's witness to Jesus. What John and Matthew and Mark and Luke all do in their different and complementary ways is to demonstrate the impact of the truth of the resurrection of Jesus on the disciples when he subsequently appeared to them. That is the evidence which the New Testament deals with, the eyewitness accounts of those disciples when Jesus met them, talked with them, and on one occasion even had breakfast with them. Now, if you read those accounts, and I would encourage you to do so, you will find that they are not written as poetic descriptions of Jesus' lasting significance so that he lives on in the memory bank of the disciples. No, these men and women are not interested in the mere survival of Jesus' memory. They are interested in the reality of his physical resurrection, the body of Jesus. A few years ago, a Sunday Times article about Freddie Mercury, the lead singer of Queen, ended with these words. So Freddie is not dead. He may not have been spotted in as many supermarkets as Elvis, but his fans are just as reluctant to let him go. Pop stars are immortal because they provide the soundtrack for other people's lives. Is that what we mean by the resurrection of Jesus? That he's alive in the sense of his life provides a soundtrack for us? No, that is not what the New Testament witness to Jesus' resurrection is all about. It doesn't simply keep the melody of Jesus alive in the hearts and minds of people because that's what they desperately want to hear. No, the various gospel accounts describe just how reluctantly the disciples came to believe the truth of the resurrection. They have to be persuaded over and over again. When Mary discovers that the stone has been removed from the entrance, she doesn't automatically say, Jesus is alive. They were not expecting or looking for the resurrection event. It was not a projection of a hoax onto reality to make them feel better about their loss. And the language there in the text is very time-specific. Early on the first day of the week. And then that known tomb is approached by known people, and so on. The claim that they eventually make, that Jesus was seen by them physically alive in a recognizable body, builds and builds. That, of course, was the toughest claim to make. It would have been far easier for the disciples to talk in terms of Jesus' spiritual resurrection. Jesus, the metaphor for hope. But the disciples took the hard route by talking about the resurrection of an actual physical body. Hard because if it wasn't true, at any moment, someone in Jerusalem could have said, "What are you on about? Here's the body of Jesus, and it's dead, lifeless, over." But you see, no one ever came forward with the body of Jesus to dismiss their claims because no one ever could. Not even the authorities, who had every reason to do so, to stamp on this rumor that Jesus was alive physically. Not even the authorities. Because if someone in Jerusalem then or at any point had produced the body of Jesus, then we wouldn't be here tonight. Christian faith would have no basis. The Christian church would not have got off the ground. The claims of the early disciples would have been discredited as bogus. That's all it would have taken to undermine the whole foundation of Christianity. But these people, the disciples, held on to the story. They stuck by it. And as I said, some were even killed themselves for proclaiming the message that Jesus was physically alive. There's a great little insight into the psychology of truth from the experience of Chuck Colson. Colson was Richard Nixon's senior associate during the Watergate scandal of the 1970s, and Colson, with the others, went to prison because of the Watergate affair. And after serving time in prison, Chuck Colson spoke about his newfound Christian faith, and he reflected on the 40 years in which Christ's disciples never backed down on their claims about the resurrection. You see, Colson knew from his Watergate experience that truth has a way of slipping out. He comments, "We couldn't hold our stories together for 3 weeks under that pressure. I was around the most powerful men in the world, but we couldn't hold to the lie. If the resurrection wasn't true, those disciples could never have held out. Someone would have dug out the tape or something." So reflecting on John's account of this real resurrection and real life, physical life of Jesus, let's ask some questions. Is it possible? Is the resurrection possible? Well, dead men don't rise. We all know that. So if Jesus did, it must be something quite unparalleled. Now, that doesn't make it impossible. 200 years ago in Britain, you would have believed that all swans were white. Rumors about black swans coming from the southern hemisphere would have been dismissed as wild hoaxes or a case of mistaken identity. But the fact of the matter is, black swans did exist, even though the British had never seen them. Is it possible that Jesus rose physically, bodily, from the dead? Let's not dismiss the possibility simply because it's outside our experience. If God exists, and if his Son came into the world and lived a perfect life as the Christian faith suggests, then why should it be deemed impossible that God should raise Jesus from the dead? Second question, not just is it possible, but is it true? Well, the fact that John's primary witness in verse 1 there to the empty tomb is a woman is astonishing in the culture of the first century. And it wasn't just John, but Matthew and Mark and Luke. They each make the women as the first and primary witnesses to the resurrection of Jesus. You see, in the first century, you wouldn't build your case in a court of law on the testimony of females. That was just the way it was. But here is a movement, the Christian movement, so confident of the truth it's proclaiming that women are the first on record to know and tell that Jesus is alive. If you had made up a lie about a man rising from the dead in the first century, why would you add that women were the primary witnesses and hope to be believed? Then, of course, there's the evidence of the empty tomb, which I've already covered. No one ever disputed the fact that the tomb was empty. The debate has always been about how. The third answer to the question, is it true? Primary witnesses are women, empty tomb. The third answer to that question, is it true, are the appearances of Jesus. We have several of those appearances recorded in John chapter 20. The first, of course, to Mary, later in the day. And then, later on in that day, to the disciples in the upper room where they're all locked away in fear. And then a week later, to Thomas with the other disciples. You see, there are so many different and varied appearances of Jesus over a period of time. The rest of the gospel accounts record such appearances over a 6-week period to individuals, to groups of people, even to 500 people at the same time. That's a staggering collection of appearances. And when the Apostle Paul writes his first letter to the Christian church in Corinth at some point in the early 50s, less than 2 decades after the resurrection event, he refers to a tradition already established within the Christian faith even earlier than that. He talks about this great tradition that's been handed on to him from others. Here are his famous words. Now, brothers, I want to remind you of the gospel I preached to you, which you received and on which you've taken your stand. By this gospel you're saved. For what I received, I passed on to you as of first importance, that Christ died for our sins, according to the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the 3rd day, according to the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Peter and then to the 12. After that, he appeared to more than 500 of the brothers at the same time, most of whom are still living. Then, the fourth evidence that this is true is the transformed lives of the disciples themselves. That is a very powerful indicator of truth. You see, what else can explain the turnaround in these people from being those who at the cross where Jesus died had all but given up, where some had denied him and most had deserted him? What explains the turnaround from that state of mind to the indestructible conviction that they went around sharing with people in Jerusalem that he was alive? Which brings me towards the end of this exploration about the resurrection. Is it possible? Is it true? Finally, does it matter? Does it matter? Does it matter that Jesus rose from the dead? Well, let me point you in some directions as to why it matters. It matters because it is the heart of the good news. This is what our Christian faith is all about. Not a dead hero, but a living Savior. There would be nothing to get excited about this evening. There'd be no communion to share if Jesus is not risen and alive. The date was June the 18th, 1815, when Wellington faced Napoleon at Waterloo, and the whole country waited nervously for news of the outcome of the battle. In a world without email and text messages or even telegrams, semaphore, signals, flags was the best way of communicating quickly over large distances. And one of the main lookout posts was the roof of Winchester Cathedral, not that far away, of course, from where the English Channel could just be seen. At last, the signal ships came into view, and the first word was spelled out. Wellington, it said, followed by the second word, defeated. Then a thick fog descended, and the message could no longer be seen. The depressing news began to spread from beacon to beacon across the land. But after a few hours, the sea mist lifted, and only then could the signal be completed. Wellington defeated the enemy. It must have felt a bit like that for the disciples, as the broken body of their friend and leader was taken down from the cross and buried in that tomb. In the weakness of that scene, the message seemed depressingly clear: Jesus defeated. But 48 hours later, reports started circulating that Jesus was alive. The gloom began to lift. The message read, Jesus defeated the enemy. And ever since that day, from cathedrals to chapels, the Christian church has signaled the good news that in the resurrection of Jesus, there is an exit strategy for our lives and our world. Death does not have the final say. God speaks an irreversible word of new life and hope through the cross and resurrection of his Son. You see, the cross of Jesus on which he died faces us up to the disturbing reality that we cannot change ourselves. We cannot alter our basic inclination to live for ourselves and not for God. But the cross is only half the story. For while we cannot change ourselves, the wonderful news is that God can. By the resurrection of Jesus, he can. It's been said that if your religion cannot change you, then you should change your religion. Christianity is a message of hope about the reality of change which God brings about in us and our world. And the great evidence for that is the resurrection of Jesus. He lives, and he lives to change us, to bring us forgiven into God's presence. He lives to defeat the power of sin and death in us. He lives to bring us strength and hope every day, so that by his risen life, he might conquer those fears in us, those demons that defy us, those battles that weaken us. It matters. It matters because the resurrection explains the existence of the church. The reality of the church down through the running ages. What else explains that long history of congregations and believers prepared to suffer for their faith? What explains it is the resurrection itself. Finally, it matters because death is answered. Death is answered. Death is defeated. The resurrection of Jesus answers the question of human destiny. You know, our human fears, they are real and they are many. But there is one fear in particular which haunts our human experience, the fear of death and what next. You see, when Jesus rose from the grave, when the angels proclaimed to the women, he is not here, he is risen, the great truth of Easter is that God has an answer for our fears. That God will speak into our lives, especially about our fear of death and the ultimate future. In one of London's great art galleries, there's a painting entitled Checkmate. It depicts the legendary Dr. Faustus. Faustus was the character who, in legend, sold his soul to the devil. And the painting in the art gallery is of a game of chess. And the devil is smiling as he leans across the board. And Faustus is frowning as he realizes that he's in check with nowhere to move his king. He knows the game is over. One day, into the gallery came a chess grandmaster. And he saw the painting of Faustus and the devil. And he was fascinated as he looked at the chessboard by the problem of the checkmate. He studied where the pieces were on the board again and again. And then he let out a cry across the art gallery. There's another move! There's another move! That is one of the glorious truths of the resurrection. In Jesus, God says, there's another move. There is no circumstance, you see, which can box God in or outmaneuver his power or outstrip his resources. Death will never checkmate the God of everlasting life. That is what the resurrection means. Jesus, by his resurrection, offers us the answer to our ultimate fear, that fear of death. And so it is that tonight we are here as a Christian church because Jesus is alive. We discover what it means to live in God's world with hope and purpose for every day and for that ultimate future because by his Spirit, Jesus is with us. And we step out into this coming week knowing that God in Christ is for us. For Jesus is alive, the resurrection and the life. And he calls us from that power he has over the universe as the Lord of life and death, he calls us to trust him, to put our faith and confidence and hope in him, to understand that he can make that other move on our behalf. So as we sing our closing song, let's thank God for the resurrection reality of Jesus Christ. And if we know that Christ is alive, and if we're trusting Christ for ourselves, you walk with confidence out of this building. God has it all covered. If you're not yet sure that Jesus is the resurrection and the life for you, then there are some leaflets available. We'd love to talk to you as we gather in a moment now for tea and coffee and refreshments. Just make sure that you know the answer that God provides for you in Jesus. He is the Lord and Savior. So we sing together in our closing song. Glory to Jesus, risen, conquering Son. Endless is the victory over death you won.